Hello, everyone. It is me, David Chen, here on the YouTube channel at youtube.com/DaveChensky, as well as on my podcast, Culturally Relevant, which you can check out at culturallyrelevantshow.com. And today I'm here to talk about Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings with one of my favorite film critics. In my estimation, one of the best film critics on the planet right now. It's Walter Chaw from Film Freak Central. Walter, thanks for chatting with me today.
David, you're one of mine. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, appreciate you being here and really excited to dive into this topic with you because I've been seeing some of your tweets about Shang-Chi. You've been tweeting about it at your Twitter handle, Mangiotto. And I was like, we gotta talk about this movie, Walter, because in many ways, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a culmination of a lot of stuff that I have been interested in and working in this industry of reviewing movies for the internet and not seeing any Asian American superheroes and wanting to see that, then getting Snake Eyes first, and that was a little disappointing, but now finally Shang-Chi. So the way this is going to work is a few ground rules. First of all, you can listen to the audio version of this conversation we're about to have over on my podcast, Culturally Relevant. Check it out at culturallyrelevantshow.com. Be sure to also follow Walter's work at filmfreakcentral.net. We are going to spoil Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings thoroughly. So if you have not seen it yet, do not want to be spoiled, definitely pause this, bookmark it, come back after you have seen it. Okay, so just want to lay down the ground rules. But yeah, I was pretty ecstatic after I saw Shang-Chi. I was really excited about the movie, and I think that uh, one of the reasons was I thought it was like the best martial arts action I'd ever seen in a Marvel film, and clearly like had been inspired by the martial arts films that I'd seen as a kid, movies by John Woo and Jackie Chan, and so on and so forth. Um, Beyond that, though, it's just as amazing to see things like Mandarin Chinese as a language represented in a major blockbuster film, spoken in context in which it would actually make sense. And compare that to like the Disney film Mulan that came out last fall, and it's like everyone in that movie spoke English. It really was weird, and there's something very moving, Walter, about seeing folks uh, speak Chinese in like a major blockbuster film. I was like, this is very rare, and like people have a chance to be exposed to this culture and its language in a way that they never have been before. And they were really bold with it in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Like they like the opening 10 minutes, like a lot of it was in Chinese, and so I think there's just a lot of like power in seeing one's or elements of one's culture represented on the big screen. So that's kind of my opening salvo. Overall, I really enjoyed the movie. It had some problems, a lot of CG mess. The third act, I think, lost a lot of people, but I really enjoyed the movie. What were your overall thoughts on Shang-Chi and Legend of the Ten Rings?
Well, the first time that I heard Mandarin spoken on a street somewhere, just like kind of when I was walking around, was I used to spend summers with my dear friend Keith in Seattle. I would go up there, his family's from there, and we would spend summers there and tooling around the Lopez Island, going to Vancouver. So walking down the street in Vancouver one day, I heard someone speaking Mandarin. I turned around and tears sprung to my eyes. It was a remarkable moment. And of course, I was already in college by then. I've grown up in Colorado. I've lived here my whole life, and we used to have a Chinatown here, but it was burned down by the Klan. And a few Chinese people were saved by the prostitutes that worked in the red light district down there. It's a pretty cool story, but not cool the part that the Chinese got burned out. But
Yeah.
anyway, there's not a lot of Chinese people here in Denver, and I had never heard Mandarin spoken in that context. So to your point, yeah, it is something magical to see your language that you grew up with in your house. Your parents spoken in a wider context in this country that is the only country that I've ever known. It's massively important, and it's interesting to talk about Shang-Chi for me because I didn't like the film, and I found it ultimately to be a little bit dangerous. But I cried a couple times because I'd been waiting, as you have been, as we all have been, for a long time to see an American film company make a movie that isn't just openly disrespectful of Chinese people, of Asian people.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and the thing that I wrestle with a little
Our
bit with
standards, by the
Shang-Chi.
way, are incredibly high. I just want to put that out there. Just don't be openly disrespectful of Asian people, of Chinese people, and we're good
Hey,
to go.
that's all I am asking. Please don't perpetuate the stereotypes that get us murdered. And I'm in, and I'm in.
That'd be great.
I think a movie that does a little bit more than that, also by Disney, was Rogue One, when it has those two characters that use Mandarin only once in the film, I think, but in a really poignant way when they call the Felicity Jones character Mei,
Mm,
a little sister, which the use of familial pronouns, is it pronouns, in Chinese is a very meaningful thing. When you adopt someone into your trust and your circle, you refer to them as Mei or Didi or Guga.
yeah.
Those are terms of affection, terms of respect, and they do it very subtly in that film. I have to think it was an improvisation, but it's one that moves me even now, to see that in a Star Wars film, where we're not the Nemoidians, the noble Jedi. We're not those characters in that universe.
Hmm.
Was meaningful to me in a really profound way. So to your point, watching Shang-Chi, I was very emotional a couple of times just watching Tony Leung on screen, a couple of times, even though he's being forced to speak Mandarin and not Cantonese, which is his native tongue. He speaks Mandarin with a Cantonese accent. Even though he's being forced to speak that instead for whatever reason. I know Marvel people will say it's because he's the Mandarin, but I mean, for me, I think it's more to do with mainland China imposing sort of its will on movies that it wants to show on its shores. Um, but hearing it is significant, significant, and I would never discount that. And like with so many of the things that I have objections to, like with Coda, like with movies like that, if the community that's being profiled by these movies finds something a net positive, my God, yes, go with God about that. I'm all for it.
But
Um,
Walter, it's your approval that I long for, not the community's.
yeah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, how does Batman become a superhero? Right? He becomes a superhero because he's super rich and he goes insane watching his parents get killed. Spider-Man, it gets bitten by a radioactive spider that's irradiated by the same gamma radiation that makes the Incredible Hulk the Incredible Hulk. We go down the list. Captain America, it's a military thing. How, what is Shang-Chi's deal? He's he knows kung fu. He is a product of a mystical line. His father is an immortal being. They go to Chinese Brigadoon to
Mm-hmm.
fight dragons
Mm-hmm.
and mythical beasts that are ill represented and not understood.
Mm-hmm.
By the film itself, they're just sort of like wallpaper. Like when you
Right.
go to a
Just to just
Chinese
to
restaurant.
yeah,
Yeah,
let's clarify what you're saying there, right? So like the creatures that appear in the final act of the movie, right? Like massive dragons, stuff like that. There's very little explanation given for what is even happening, or if there is explanation, it's very rushed, right? That's kind of what you're
right.
saying? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not, it's just window dressing,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. It's like, somebody did like a quick Google search of Chinese mythological creatures and let's just kind of like, let's go with it. Let's go with it. And it's like, there's the Disney sidekick animal that they have in this, it is a Dijon. It's a six-legged, winged creature with no facial features, and it represents sort of a chaotic sort of creature. It's a creature that will follow any leader. One of the great evil mythological creatures in China is a Dijon, and it's a bad person because it's like that first ring of Dante's Hell where there's everyone's following a flag without really knowing who they're chasing, and um, it's just kind of funny and cute in Shang-Chi. And I think, I was bothered by the pronunciation of the name too. The character was created by a couple of white guys in 1973 to sort of capitalize on the kung fu craze in the United States, right? To directly capitalize on Kung Fu, the TV series, which was notoriously the series where Bruce Lee was too Chinese to be in American television. And so they made Shang-Chi the character who was the son of Fu Manchu, Marvel had briefly owned the rights to the Sax Rohmer character, and he's the master of kung fu. He's all this stuff, and it's there's essentially a problem. You're talking about waiting your whole life for a Chinese superhero. It's like I'm still waiting for one. This is an American superhero, a white American superhero with Chinese features, sporting Chinese stereotypes, and the degree that they do or they don't deal with that is fascinating. But I mean, I haven't thought this through very well. I'll probably get in trouble for it. But at the end of the day, all the people that are dunking on Doctor Strange for casting Tilda Swinton kind of got what they wanted with this movie, which is casting Asian people to portray a white created character. And it's like there's issues. So here's the secret. I don't know about you. I got bullied constantly and beaten up a few times by kids who wanted to know how much kung fu I knew and if I knew kung fu and if I would fight. And it's like one of these things that Asian Americans deal with. I think is this idea that we're all secret kung fu masters. The movie doesn't dispel that. The movie is about a secret kung fu master. There's this talk about Aquafina, right, being she's a slacker. She parks cars, and I thought, okay, great, this is going to be a better luck tomorrow sort of undermining of the model minority mythology that's done a great harm to not only us but to the African American community. And they immediately have a scene where they say, okay, you're a valet, but you graduated with honors from Berkeley, and you, Sean, you know 4 different languages. There's That's not doing us a lot of favors. She also scolds her mother by reminding her mother that you're an American too, mom. It plays a lot of lip service to this idea of what Asian Americans are acceptable and what Asian Americans are not. And I don't know any of my Asian friends who came over when they were 14. They've not lost their accents. He's superhuman for being able to do that in 10 years. There's an expectation that's placed upon the Americanness of these characters, but also the Asianness. And this I'm almost completely divorced from Asian culture. I've done some studies as a grown up, but this film is completely reliant on his close, his intimate relationship with Asian culture and his fidelity to his father. So all of these ideas behind Orientalism about the East being rigid, the East being inflexible to time, and therefore inferior to the West, which is fluid, is on display here because essentially what it is this immortal, ageless father villain in China who must fight a medieval Chinese village using dragons and other garbage to what? To pass on 10 mystical rings. Even the Kung Fu TV show reboot that's on the CW now and had some success this year, it's about 8 mystical swords. How many mystical objects do you have in your house? How many magic wind chimes? How many? I've got pictures of Led Zeppelin on my wall. I don't have that connection. So, whatever things are benefiting Asian Americans in this movie, it wants to, for me, I feel like it reinforces stereotypes and expectations
Mm-hmm.
of Asian Americans rather than debunks them. Why can't Sean be an ABC, a term that they use in the film, American Born Chinese? I've also heard banana or moon pie. Why can't he be yellow on the outside and white on the inside? Why can't he be that? But no, if you dig deep enough in us, if you chip away the nougaty exterior of any Asian person, America thinks, you're going to get this well of mysticism and this worship of chi and honor. If you chip that away from me, you're just going to see a guy that's seen all the Police Academy movies. No, I'm not that person. And
Mm-hmm.
this movie doesn't have to be just for me. It doesn't. And I don't know how large of a population I represent of Asian Americans, but I was born here. I speak Chinese with the horrible and embarrassing American accent. I've gotten more racial hate from mainland Chinese people than I've gotten from Americans. It is, we are creatures. I am a creature of no country, and there's no real place that I belong. I'm obviously different in the United States among the white majority. I'm obviously different in China because I was born in the United States, and there's resentments on both sides. So where do I belong? Is it in this film? Is it a place? That's the longing that I'm longing for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to be very fair, it's like there's possibly no film that can really address that longing, or at least I would have thought so before I saw Minari last year,
Yeah.
which actually does address that issue poignantly. piquantly about being adrift in a country that doesn't accept you and marooning yourself from a country that used to. Um, that's me.
So,
And speaking
Walter,
only for
you've
me.
said
Yeah.
about 18 interesting things there that I want to respond to, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them, so I will only try my best. I think part of what I'm hearing in what you're saying is I think there's just like some anxiety and angst in general, whether or not they do a good job of commodifying a culture in some way via a mass market film like this. Is that do you think that's right? Like any time a large multinational conglomerate like Disney makes a movie that is, inspired by, based off of, or takes elements from some culture, inevitably some kind of violence will be done to the culture in the process, right? Like, and I don't mean like physical violence. I just mean like there are things that need to be stripped away. There are things that need to be simplified. There's things that need to be made more audience friendly, right? And the culture is diluted and done violence to in that process. Uh, would you agree with that statement? And if so, right, like to me, part of it is just like part of what you're saying is like that a blockbuster film of this kind is in some ways inherently at odds potentially with kind of the things you're looking for in a movie. Is that right? What do you think?
Well, well, look, I mean, I'm going to give the political answer here because I don't really know how to address that directly. I uh, I labored for the longest time under this sort of illusion that I had no biases. And the older you get, and hopefully the smarter you get, or the more beaten up you get for being stupid, you come to realize that you're a bundle of mess of biases. And I have my own, and everyone who comes to these projects has their own, obviously, biases as well. And my goal is to say, is to point out things that possibly are an example of someone else's bias in a film that they're not examining well. I don't see myself as a great teacher or whatever. Whenever I do this stuff or talk about these movies that are personal in some way, it's a means of me sort of exploring my own reactions to it. So if I'm uncomfortable about Shang-Chi, that's my issue. There's some stuff going on with me that's making it hard for me to just enjoy something like this. And is that because I'm uncomfortable with, being raised a certain way, being comfortable being visible? Yeah, absolutely. I'm comfortable with that. I'm in, my parents, my dad never voted his whole life here because he came from a place
Sorry, just to be
where
clear, you are uncomfortable or comfortable being visible? Sorry, which one is it?
un, uncomfortable.
Yeah, so you would like to not be visible. You would like to be you recede into the background as like that's your
Absolutely,
personality. Gotcha.
absolutely. And I really believe that this is how I was anyway. I can't speak for the whole diaspora. That's madness. But I was and raised is to be invisible and humble and apologize a lot
Hmm.
for if
I
I
know
ever
this
become
about you.
visible. Yeah, I'm hardwired. I've been given some software that's a little faulty. But so any kind of exposure like this makes me worried that it's good exposure, that it's the right kind of exposure, that it's
Hmm.
exposure that doesn't perpetuate stereotypes that made it easier for this country to outlaw Chinese people for 20 years recently, in the
Mm.
last couple hundred years, that we don't do something to get put back into camps, that we don't trouble the water in a way, and that's hard for people that are born in the United States because the United States has a real outlaw streak. We're born to trouble the water, but I was raised not to, and so that's one tension when I watch a movie like Shang-Chi. A long way about answering your question.
Yeah.
I don't think the blockbuster form is incompatible with an honest reckoning with these issues. The scene in the film where they're sitting with their two friends and they're talking about, I got made fun of, you know how that is. And all that is a really noble, I think, attempt to have this conversation in a blockbuster film. That's great. You're going to say, hey, Asian people, even though they're the model minority, they get bullied a lot. And because they have this thing that held up in terms of model minorities within their own culture, they do, sometimes they rebel and they take jobs as valets or whatever. And I rebelled. I was supposed to be an engineer. I was a mechanical engineer for a semester before I became an English major and broke everybody's heart. And so,
I was supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer. Now I'm making YouTube videos of Walter Chaw on my YouTube channel, Walter. You
and I
know,
think we
so
both made the right choice somewhere along the way. But I think it's not incompatible because they could have done that. They could have been honorable in terms of that conversation. But what they are instead is they say, well, my mom is wrong. She doesn't want to assimilate. I look Chinese, but I don't speak Chinese, except I do speak Chinese, because by the end of the film, Aquafina's character understands these obscure directions in sort of a courtly Mandarin. That's shoot the monster in the throat. I don't think my parents ever taught me that phrase. I had to read subtitles during that sequence.
hmm
But this woman whose Chinese sucks speaks really well, and that plays into this idea that if you're Chinese, you must speak. Um, or if you're Asian, you must speak it. All of the stereotypes I think that we've been trying to fight as Asian Americans, this movie underscores and amplifies. Um, and it's done with this sort of spirit of progress. But you mentioned Snake Eyes, and I mentioned the Kung Fu reboot. It's like, so these Asian people are secret martial artists. How is that moving the ball forward?
hmm
These people are mired in the mysticism of the Far East. How does that move the ball forward? When we got a commercial in the 1970s, it was to give an ancient Chinese secret about getting a stain out of a shirt. This is not progress. It's just really fancy and expensive regression. And it's patronizing to me that the only until the mid-credit sequence, the only other Marvel character that you see in this movie is the Chinese one, is Benedict Wong. Forgetting that the Wong character in Doctor Strange is like genetically bred to be a butler. That's his character. So the people that are dunking on Doctor Strange for whatever whitewashing they think happened there, forget that that's the same movie that made Wong, an Asian American icon now for some reason. So it's
Right, like in the comics, he was a much smaller, more subservient role, whereas he's now been elevated to like almost not quite, but almost like a main cast member in these Avengers films, right? So,
absolutely,
yeah,
and by its nature, not the blockbuster form, but maybe the Marvel form. If you're continuing to insist on adapting characters made by white American men in the 1960s and 70s, um, yeah, it's incompatible with representation, with positive representation for Asians,
right.
no matter what your intentions are. If you say, oh, what's wrong with being really good at martial arts? What's wrong with speaking four languages or having an honors, a degree with honors from Berkeley? Nothing's wrong with that, but the expectation that all of us must, that cripples a lot of us. Forgive me for using that term, but it hamstrings a
Yeah,
lot of us.
yeah.
And expectation. I was just talking with a friend last night, Bill, my editor at Film Freak Central, as saying that saying someone has potential is probably the most violence you can do to someone. And that's all that I heard for my whole life. And it's like, that's, boy, I hope that I reach that potential one day, because I don't really know what the goal. That's a soft goal. I've climbed every mountain. I'm not happier. So here's Shang-Chi, right? Who the the way that Tony Leung pronounces it is, it means, rising chi, rising air. Chi does not make you fly and shoot air bullets. By the way, uh, fans of Mulan, I feel like I should tell you that. Um, and it was the product of two white guys that, it's like that movie, that David Gordon Green movie, where they name these two well-meaning rednecks adopt a Chinese girl and they name her Feng Shui. But it's that kind of name. Okay, and
hmm
so the way that Tony Leung pronounces it, that's what it sounds like to me, to my ear. The way that Simu Liu pronounces it means sweet smelling air, air that smells good, Shang-Chi. And he's very specific about Shang, pronouncing it that way. Um, and for me, it's like, all right, this is, it's good to talk about how Chinese is a difficult language. That if you if you make the wrong inflection for the right sort of base, you say something completely different than what you mean to say. You say either pig or you say rent. They're very different sort of ideas with the same base. And I like that scene in the movie too. I felt emotional when they were doing that. except that his pronunciation is so strange that it reminded me of how this is again a white construct. This is what a Chinese name sounds like to a white person. So over and over again, I have these reminders about how this is not a movie that is for or by Asian Americans necessarily. It's not a character that was created by Asians. It uses Asian artifacts, it uses Asian settings, it uses Asian ideas according to the West, but it has nothing in it that speaks to me, and
Hmm.
that's a personal reaction.
Right.
Now, broadly, if you make $100 million in a weekend and you have an Asian lead, cool, cool. I can't wait for that to happen with a movie that's not about Asians knowing kung fu.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, over the course of the last few years, we've seen Disney try to redo some of its older movies with people that were actually of that culture represented in the cast and occasionally behind the camera, right?
Yep.
Other good examples being like Aladdin, right? Like I thought Aladdin and Lion King were mostly creatively bankrupt. Obviously, people worked really hard on them. Like the visuals were very impressive, and like there's a lot of like hard craftsmen working on those movies. But they mostly were just like, in some cases, like shot for shot remake of the original, and but using cast members that were actually, uh, I get, this is more for Aladdin than Lion King because obviously those are all animals, but for Aladdin specifically, I'm thinking of the fact that like you have like a Middle Eastern lead in that movie, and like basically my thinking is we're all these toys we're playing in, right? Like these toys that are being played with are like you said, they're all made by white people, right? It's all like the white people created the sandbox, and like they threw a bunch of toys in there, and then like people of color have the chance to like potentially like pick one of these toys up and like maybe like redo it in a way that looks more like what we would want it to be, or that would honor more of what we are interested in. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's still going to be recognizably what you said, right? Recognizably something that a white person made. And is it better for society, for diversity, for representation, for people of color in general, and our place in society that, um, you know, that this happened at all? Like for me, the answer is yes, because I think the sheer tonnage of negative representations or unflattering representations of Asian Americans is so high and has been for so long, that in general, I think I have a lower bar for you when it comes to like what kind of representation I'm willing to accept, right? This is representation of this movie that I think in some ways makes uh, being an Asian American, not just an Asian, but an Asian American, into something that is desirable and aspirational. And that's just rare.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and,
I mean, I guess
and
I
and
would say that.
also part of it I wonder is like, is it a question of execution? Because these are the director is half Japanese, I believe, and the writer, one of the writers, is half Chinese. And so like they brought a lot of their heritage and experiences with them to this film, and so I don't know. To me, it feels too reductive to just say, uh, you know, it was a character made by a white person and like therefore is completely irredeemable. It's like, isn't there some value in like having an Asian American like take that character that was made by a white person and try to give it their own spin on it, and therefore be successful and therefore create more opportunities for future Asian Americans to be on screen in front of behind the camera. Like, I think that ultimately at the end of the day, it's a net positive. But I also am hearing what you're saying about the instances of representation on screen as potentially reinforcing bad stereotypes that you've experienced throughout your life, right?
Well, that's exactly right, and I'm with you. If this results in the sudden green light of several other projects, helmed by and generated by Asian Americans, Yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad to be here for this watershed moment. And I think at the end of the day, I'm a little bit leery of these excited pronouncements of watershed moments. We've had so many.
We should
You
all
know,
be leery. I'm
yeah. I
not
mean, it's like I
yeah.
think I was shocked that racism was still a thing after what Glory, but then 12 Years a Slave reminded me that it was a thing, but now it's solved, right? So there's a
You're
lot
being
of
facetious,
watershed
just to be
moments.
clear, but yes.
I'm being terribly facetious in the worst possible way,
Yeah.
the unfunny way. That's the worst way. Here's the thing, though, is that all of your points are valid, absolutely, and I agree with you. Had the film done those things, and I think my objection specifically with Shang-Chi is that it traffics in some of the most damaging stereotypes that Asian Americans have to overcome, period. And if it hadn't done that, wonderful. I'm
Hmm.
a big fan of the Mandarin character from Iron Man 3 because it says these are the terrible, stupid stereotypes that we have imposed on and look at how dumb it is. It's played by this failed British method actor, and it's just it scares people because it's a we're gonna name you after a fruit, and that's going to scare people. Which that line would have been a lot funnier if we hadn't labored under like an orange dictator for the last 4 years. But you know, that's great. What Shang-Chi does is it says that Asian Americans, underneath it all, know martial arts, know how to speak Chinese, and are tied to mystical father figures in their motherland. And that's I don't know that that helps, and that's something that I think white Americans think and have thought always when they look
Hmm.
at someone who's been here since the railroad, right? Who is like 5, 6, 7 generations into the United States and doesn't speak a word of English, and is as American as freaking apple pie, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, what what does Shang-Chi do to them, or to their children who are going to be asked on the hey, can I see your 10 rings? Can I see can I see the stuff that you have? Do you have anything from China? Do you have any? He's like, no, actually, I'm about as Chinese as you are Irish, my friend. And it's I think it does harm to paint so broadly. Now,
Hmm.
does this film speak specifically to people who have immigrated here in their teens and still have a very strong connection to the motherland and still have this idea about Mandarin being the true language, the regal language, and Cantonese being a gutter tongue? Does that speak directly to an audience? Absolutely. Does this open the eyes of white executives to say, hey, boy, these Chinese and Asians, they have money to spend. And they should have known that already. Look at our cities. For a place where, you know, for Americans to believe that Chinese men are asexual, right? Or ridiculous. We come from the most overpopulated place on the planet. So that didn't happen because of you. For white people to say, "Hey, they're so retrograde, admired in tradition, and stuck in the past." Well, I mean, have you ever been to Beijing? Have you been to Taipei? Because yeah, we're the center of some pretty major metropoli. All of these things are damaging to us.
So
All of these ideas are
just I just want to
damaging.
clarify right the point you're making there, which is that basically these stereotypes have existed despite many counterexamples in the real world, right? And so
Absolutely.
maybe like the force of stereotyping is just a massive, powerful force that is hard to negate, even with actual clear evidence to the contrary in real life.
And
And
it seeps into us though
yeah,
too, into us individually. I mean, I have hated the way that I've looked for my whole life. I've abhorred it. I look nothing like Luke Skywalker. If I could do something to change the way that I looked every step along the way, I would have done it. I loathe how I look. I loathe the way that I was embarrassed by my parents whenever they would bring food for the potluck. It's like egg rolls or something. I would be so mortified, and I begged that they didn't do it. And I had a pretty nasty divorce from my parents for not I'd never reconciled before my dad died. So it matters the way that we portray aliens as alien, Asians as essentially alien beings
mm-hmm.
that are not comprehensible to the Western mind. We're inscrutable. We're mystical. We are closet Miyagi's. We don't mess with us in the diner because we're gonna beat up every person in there. We're secret warriors, all of us. And Shang-Chi, I think, does that.
Hmm.
Does that because of the nature of this specific character, because of the way that we internalize our own self-loathing and internalize
Right.
our own identity. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think like kind of the alternate universe you perceive is like, wouldn't it have been awesome if the first Asian American superhero had no connections with these stereotypes that have been like very damaging in the past? Like, imagine if Spider-Man was Asian, basically. Like it had no connection with like anything in his past, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, and I think that's
Yeah. And
there's something very appealing about that concept. But I also think that one of the things about being an Asian American that you've already kind of referred to, and that is something that I contend with, is like Asian Americans are fundamentally torn between two worlds, right? Like they are considered aliens in uh, the United States where they live, and if you go back home, it's not like people welcome you back with open arms, right? Like, so they're really like a people without any country, and in a way that I would argue other races, not that they don't also experience difficulty, but that it's like a little bit different. It's the flavor of it is different than the challenges other nationalities experience assimilating the United States. And so I think that the point I was making is just that like this is a story that tries to honor that concept, and maybe like what you would prefer is a story that like doesn't address that at all, because it's like if we even refer to like what the motherland was, or what our parents and like and some of the stereotypes that are associated with that, like that is already baseline case like damaging and shouldn't be done.
well, I would
um
love if they refer to it. And what if this movie had centered on the Aquafina character and she does her shtick, where she's like, "What? 10 mystical rings? What the hell are you talking about? Onion rings? I don't know." So that you have like a specifically American point of view. And I think she was maybe initially intended to be that. There's that scene on the bus where she says, "Look at her. She's writing her research paper on the bus. That's exactly the daughter that my mother wishes came out of her vagina." That sequence, but that's immediately at odds with who she is. She graduated with honors from Berkeley. She is that daughter already. So I feel like that line on the bus is probably an improvisation by Aquafina, who, after making the farewell, who being who she is, understands that element of the Asian American experience, and says that there are expectations placed on me by this culture. There are expectations placed on me by my parents' culture. I am torn between those things. I think that's something that makes the farewell so powerful and such a horror film for Asian Americans in a lot of ways, because it's so true. And but this movie's not interested in that. I would love it if they were going after all of this garbage, saying,
mhm.
"What you're saying? This is you're saying that's real? This is ridiculous. This is there's no Han Solo in this movie." And I think Aquafina was supposed to be that.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, oh, eye rolling at this quaint bougie crap that it's like,
I get
yeah.
what you're saying. I mean, Shang-Chi's father in the comics was Fu Manchu, which is like a very racist caricature, right?
Mhm.
And so what this movie did is, rather than make it so that his father wasn't an important part of the story at all, they cast a legend of Hong Kong cinema, and they made him like quite charismatic and attractive. Uh, and I think that that's like an approach that they could have taken. Like there's a different approach that you've outlined, right? And so, and there's obviously pluses and minuses to each. One thing I want to address right now: we're broadcasting this live on YouTube, and it's also being a podcast on culturally relevant show.com. Is some people are saying, about what I said about Asian Americans as like, isn't that all immigrants? Somebody asked the question. Rehan Khwaja says, isn't that all immigrants? I think all immigrants do uh, experience a variety of different challenges. And all I was trying to identify was that Asian Americans experience like some specific challenges that we've been discussing. The Chinese Exclusion Act being a really interesting one, which was enacted in 1882 and was the first and only law to have ever been implemented to bar people from a specific ethnic group. Now, obviously, that was over 100 years ago, but I think that like there is a distinct sense from many Asian Americans that we are. It's not even that our race is. Sometimes our race is like a liability or it's looked down upon, but more often than not, I feel like it's not even considered at all, and that is also a very alienating and disorienting experience. So anyway, I just wanted to like respond to that point that like I agree all immigrants experience challenges, and we are trying to sort of describe some of the challenges that Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans experience. Um,
I would express a larger kinship with African Americans as well, in the sense that we can't hide our difference. We can't pass.
yeah,
And that's been this, and the relationship between the Asian communities and the Black communities, I think, is a really touching and poignant one that has been weaponized against us and each other. The model minority myth is created essentially to demean and further victimize the African American community, and
yeah,
it's done harm to both communities. And I look at the kinship that the Black community had through Black exploitation, through hip hop culture, with kung fu movies, with Asian films, and I asked Melvin Van Peebles about that once, why he thought that was, and he said, you know what, we're both we're, we have the same oppressor, and these stories about the little guy triumphing in the end spoke really clearly to the Black culture that he was speaking of in the 1970s. But um, I think it's a real shame that there's so much antagonism between us now. A lot of it driven by stereotype and popular culture. And this film Shang-Chi is interesting because there's a lot of hip hop needle drops in it. In between the wood flutes and the Guangzhou foolishness, there's there's a lot of hip hop drops, and Aquafina is still sort of derided by members of the Black community for using a quote unquote Black scent for her initial fame, and it's painful for me to think about um, the possibility that we could appropriate things from each other's cultures and have it seen as something other than a sign of unity. Um, I just I think it's a tragedy that we're not unified here. Because imagine the power if we were,
yeah.
even just among the Asian diaspora. But if we could all combine with African Americans here, my God, the power. But and you see it in Wu Tang Clan, right? So there's things here in this movie that they're playing with that I wish that they had the either the courage or the knowledge to explore, rather than to use as set dressing.
Hmm. Yeah,
There's
so
so much
I
stuff
think
here.
that's one question I have is right. Like in your mind, is it the execution that was the problem, or was it like they shouldn't have even tried to make these connections at all? Like Shang Chi should never have been a guy whose father had all this mystical powers and was connected with his culture at all. Like, is it a question of the approach at all, or is it a question of the execution? Do you know what I'm saying? Is that
I,
the
th-
question make
I
sense?
think it. I think it falls somewhere in between. I think
Yeah,
the execution is pretty poor. But I also think that you know um, the the character at its essence is flawed. If you don't essentially change the character, then you're stuck with the character. If we go back
yeah,
to Doctor Strange again and we look at the ancient one, it's like, all right, do I want another ancient Asian figure teaching a white person how to be mystical in any form, whatever you do? Make him young, make him cocksure, make him funny, make him whatever. Do I ever want to see that again in something that's not like a Tarantino movie making fun of it in a way, satirizing it? Do I want that? No, I don't. Was I okay with Tilda in that role? Yeah, I was, and especially because it was clear that that was just a title. Um, and what really got me about that was that furor was once they announced the casting of Tilda Swinton. Most of our allies, most of the white people that are really on our side, David, said, "Hey, why don't you cast Michelle Yeoh?" And in my mind, it's like casting a Chinese woman as a Tibetan monk is probably the most insensitive thing that you could do next to the entire cast of Memoirs of a Geisha. It is tone deaf. It is culturally specious. It is ignorant beyond belief, and that's from the people that meant well. So Shang-Chi is a movie I think that means well. It means really well, and if it does good things, go forth and do good things. I wish it would have done the good things without perpetuating stereotypes that have destroyed our community.
All right. Well, I don't know what else there is to say about it than that. I mean, I think probably we would actually. I mean, actually, I don't even know if we agree. Like, in my opinion, you know, this movie is a net positive for the Asian American community, right? And maybe you also agree with that, but you wish it had done so in a different way. Basically, is that right?
Well, I mean, I think it's a net positive in some ways, and it's a net negative in other ways.
Right.
It's
Right.
complicated, right? I mean, I think it's a net positive because it might get other movies made
It's a
by
net
Asian
positive
American
business
creators.
wise, and
Yes,
culturally, it may be a net negative, kind of.
yeah, it's regressive. It's the same kind of crap that gets us hurt.
I don't. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to argue with you because I actually think there's so much merit to what you're saying. At the same time, I also think of like there's going to be literally millions of people that are going to discover the work of like Tony Leung and Wong Kar Wai and In the Mood for Love and Hard Boiled and Infernal Affairs that like never would have if it wasn't for Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten. And it's like that's also like you kind of have to weigh that in some ways against all the terrible stuff, the negative things, quite valid that you're saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem though is that if people are going to go look for Tony Leung's Mandarin speaking movies from which he knows kung fu, they're going to have a hard time. But if it does make people look for, the 7 movies he made with Wong Kar Wai, great, great. There's always a good part about this. I mean, you could say the same thing about Mulan, right? I mean, you could say, hey, who's that Asian person? I'm going to go look at their filmography. It's possible. It's possible. Or it could just be another old Chinese guy who knows Kung Fu in an American movie that boy, this was a cliche 1985.
Well, the
Um,
baseline is you have to create an enjoyable movie for that to happen, right?
and
So,
arguably this is. And,
right.
it's like, overall, I would say, like, it's got the one good fight scene. It's got a lot of blah blah. It's got a lot of dead spots. It's at least an hour longer than it needs to be. It's got a lot of mystical mumbo jumbo. It's got a lot of pretty colors and as pretty as Marvel ever gets nowadays. And it is what it is. It feeds the beast, right? People will just want to look at this stuff forever. And so, um, hey, I mean, I'll say this. I'll say this like Black Panther, which I also didn't love, and obviously it was for me specifically, but Black Panther at least was about Afrofuturism. Um, what is Shang-Chi about? It's about ancient Oriental secrets.
Period. The end. That's kind of your ending for it. I mean, there part of that is the source material, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the movies Black Panther and Shang-Chi: The Legend of Ten Rings, like they do derive from again like these long in the case of Black Panther at least long running characters in the comics and storylines that are based on that. There is no is there a Asian superhero Asian futurism alternative that they could have used? You know what I mean? Like I don't know that there was one that would have been even as well known as Shang-Chi, who by the way was not like exactly one of the most popular uh, Asian American figures in comics at this point prior to this movie.
See, that's the problem. There
Yeah.
isn't, and the answer would be to make something like Iron Fist Asian, without like making it more mystical than it already is, or making Hawkman Asian, or going somewhere where it's like you know G, Gene Yang, the Asian American author, he did a run on Superman where Superman's Asian for a while, and it's remarkable because his story run deals with that tension between two worlds that Superman literally deals with, and Asian Americans also literally deal with, and the push pull between his Earth obligations and his Kryptonian obligations versus our obligation to the motherland and our culture and our expectations of that, and America. Superman's a character that's perfect for the Asian American diaspora, and Gene Yang wrote that wonderfully. And he's writing a series now with Shang-Chi, with his sister, sort of at odds. It's called Shang-Chi versus the Marvel Universe, I think it's called. but he's writing a whole thing, and Gene Yang is an Asian American, and he brings in some really great stuff. So it's possible to use these characters in a way that's productive, but it's also very possible, I think, as with this film, to use them in a way that's reductive. That you give lip service to representation, but not all representation is good. And you mentioned Aladdin. I don't know that you can make an indentured creature, a slave, a black person, without dealing with that in modernity. Will Smith, when he says, "When the chains fall away," and he says, "Oh, the chains, you free me from my chains." That is not an image that should go unremarked, but it does, and I think that's a problem, especially when the framing story for the new Aladdin is the genie teaching his kids about the wonders of colonialism. Um, Not everything has to be a term paper. Not everything has to be a TED talk or a lecture. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. There's just certain things. You don't put a black man in chains. You don't talk about Asian Americans this way.
All right. Well,
So it's a
Walter,
low bar.
the thing I want to take away from this conversation for me personally, even as somebody who enjoyed Shang-Chi and again thinks it's like a net positive in many ways, is that despite how things make us feel, despite how much we enjoy things, I do think that we need to consider the types of stereotypes that stories perpetuate and like be aware. It doesn't even need to mean you can't like the thing. You just need to be aware of it, think critically about it, and that way when the next piece of art comes along that maybe a little bit worse or maybe a little bit more offensive or whatever, it just is part of something that is what you're thinking about all the time, and can kind of help you understand both the work more deeply as well as its impact on our society more deeply. So,
Yeah,
this,
that's really a point eloquently made. That's something that we always told our kids as they're growing up, is that you can watch whatever you want to, but the price of it is that you have to have a conversation with us afterwards. That we have to contextualize these things and not normalize um, these images that we're being fed. That way lies destruction.
all right, Walter Chaw is a film critic at filmfreakcentral.net. And if you want to listen to this conversation in audio podcast form, check it out at culturallyrelevantshow.com. It'll be up shortly after we finish this recording. But Walter Chaw, I'm glad, it was giving me a lot of stress that you didn't like this movie. And it still does give me stress, but you know what? I'm really glad to have the conversation with you and understand more clearly like where it is you're coming from. It completely makes sense to me what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with it emotionally. Maybe intellectually I do. Maybe like in 6 months I'll be at your position on this. But I appreciate you sharing your thoughts in such an honest and heartfelt way with me. Thanks so much, man.
Well, I can't tell you how much I value your friendship and this platform that you give me occasionally to draw some fire. So thank you for that.
All right. Be well, man.
Yeah, take care.